So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services. We refined in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayeric lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yeshayahu the prophet, we find a layer of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we understand the holy documents of the Holy Creator Yahweh, we then study the holy document starting then in Yeshayahu, known as Isaiah, the 61st chapter, where you read then a section of the spring feast, the autumn feast. How can we determine what the Messiah was speaking of when he first then began reading the holy instructions? It's very simple. As always, the Creator is never complicated. The only situation with the Creator is because He has no timing restriction, then we must learn how to deal with the holy instructions, so then we can understand where the Creator comes from. So then, let's try to understand then the spring feast, the autumn feast. As we read then in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, you find that in the 23rd, from the first verse to the 21st verse, you find then the spring feast. So then, every year, the Hebrews then, they trained the Moadim, or the holy feasts, once a year, and then you find then Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, the 22nd verse, where you understand that in the time of the Gentiles, when you read Ruth, you understand then what it means, the 23rd chapter of Leviticus and 22nd verse, where then the Creator speaks and He instructed the prophet, saying then, do not cut the corners of the field. Understandably, then the Gentiles would be included in the plan of salvation. Then from the 23rd verse through the 44th, you find then the vengeance, or the autumn feast. When then Yeshayahu the prophet, known as Isaiah, was then recorded in the 61st chapter, the Messiah then, he was in the temple and he was reading a section of the holy instruction regarding the layer of the completion of the spring feast, where he was then obviously the focus of the entire scripture. Let's understand then what it means reading then the coming of Ruach HaKodesh. As we understand it then, he was given to his people. Then we understand also the holy feast as Shavuot. And also we understand the Messiah when we read then the Acts of Ruach HaKodesh, or then through the hands of the Shlishim, meaning then the disciples. We understand then the Messiah was not 40 days after his coming from the dead. Let's try to understand where the confusion comes from. Firstly, we must then understand when the Messiah came from the dead, he was absolutely deadly serious regarding this section of the holy instructions, but he was very wise. First, the Messiah, he could not take then the governments by force. What he did was the contrary. He gave then the opening of heaven, in quote, where then they found themselves extremely prosperous. So then, when we read during the time of the spring feast and the completion thereof, you find the Messiah explaining the dangers of wanting these world's promises as far as we can understand as then prosperity. The Messiah was pointing of a section of the holy instructions regarding then the functions of Ruach HaKodesh. Later, when the Messiah came from the dead and he was then proven as worthy, then he gave them prosperity as the word and what it means. But then let's understand the first chapter of Acts of the Shlishim, you find then those who were also to whom he revealed where do we get the word revealed is from Revelation. The vengeance, the explanation of the vengeance, because it was the next objective on the Holy Instructions. Let's try to understand why. He revealed himself. Revealed himself simply means revelation of the Holy Instructions. Not only the spring feast itself, as the Messiah then had proven himself. Let's try to understand why. The Messiah was very limited when he came and completed the spring feast. The disciples, they came over and they said, "But Messiah, what can we understand of the time of the end as it was then in Ezekiel, the 24th chapter?" What did he say? Came a point where the Messiah said, "It's not for you to know times in the season at this point," because he was completing yet the spring feast. When he came from the dead, he was then ready to explain then the spring feast, the autumn feast, and the 22nd of Leviticus, 22nd verse. Let's try to understand what this goes on. Then with numerous signs for 40 days. That's when the whole section of these holy instructions then is a bit confused. Not because of the prophecy. Has to do with so much persecution after the Messiah then ascended. Why do we understand this so clearly? Because the Messiah, he was so prosperous, the Messiah was so wise, as he was spending an entire year with his people. After he's coming from the dead, after he came from the dead, then the Messiah himself did understand his objective of teaching his people for an entire year, so no doubt would be left, while then the Messiah was doing his duty up with the Creator. Let's understand why. And while he then ate bread, try to understand where this is coming from. Very simply, those who also to whom he revealed himself alive after he had trialed. This section has relation with his time of the experience of the 40 days in the desert. It's not the same when he came from the dead. The reason why we have this confusion is because it was absolutely prohibited after his ascension for any of his people then to begin to talk of these holy instructions. They were severely persecuted, so much where then Yohanan went to northern Africa to get then the first holy city established. As we read these holy instructions, then you begin your understanding. Then the Messiah spent a great deal with his people, an entire year prior of his ascension. So then later would not have any doubts as far as his lordship, as we can understand, as leader, and then any doubts related with the holy instructions. What is going on in the world? What is the objective? The objective is very simple. We are expecting then the completion of the autumn feast. What do we understand of the calculation? Then Shaliach Shimon, or the disciple Peter, Peter simply means rock, was his nickname in Aramaic, but his true name was Shimon. He said very simply, 1,000 years and a day for the Creator is the same. What do we understand of this? When the Messiah then spent a couple of days with the Samaritans, we do understand each day as 1,000 years. Yom Creation Day, or days. So then, we understand a couple of 1,000 years, and when the Messiah then was placed on a pole, he was placed then, if you make the calculations very properly, was then 4998. This was the time. It was very, very important for the Messiah then to die for his people. And then if you understand a couple of 1,000 years later, you find then the Messiah was obviously born in 4998, and he was placed on a pole then obviously 33 years later. Let's make these certainly and then surely. He was born then in 4998. He was placed on a pole 5032. So let's then make this very clear, because the birth of salvation was then during the time of 5032 when he was placed on a pole, because with this time then he had purchased then the sins. He had purchased our lives in exchange for his sacrifice. So let's then make this very clear. The Gentiles and his own people, they were born with this knowledge when he died. Then, as we understand this section, we then begin our quest with the understanding of the time of the end and the combat of the end. The Holy Instructions, as then Shaliach Shaul later, as he was explaining layer by layer of the Holy Instructions, you find sections then during the time of the completion of the spring feast, and then Shaliach Shaul was then the dispensator. He was then revealing the Holy Instructions to his people. So much so, sometimes he would teach the entire night. This is how much time is required for them, the people, to understand the layers. The Messiah said not a layer is going to be left undone. He never said word or any other part of the instruction. He was simply saying layer upon layer. So then, what can you expect of the autumn feast? Firstly then, we must study then Daniel, the 11th chapter. Daniel is specific. The 11th chapter is related with the time of the restoration period, where then we understand then China is then the kingdom of the east, kingdom of the north being the Soviet Union, and the kingdom of the south is Africa, yet birthing itself regarding then the restoration period. At first, it's not easy understanding these holy instructions. As you read more and more and more, and you shift your mind from the Greco-Roman translation, and then you understand the Itzayelic lineage, these translations, then it begins your quest of then educating your mind, as Shaliach Shaul had said, renew your mind with the holy instructions. It's not very easy, because people sometimes they get away from the path. It's not easy every day studying the holy instructions. There are some people who are dedicated, and some people sometimes they read and sometimes they don't. Every time you don't read the holy instructions is then your backyard when you do not garden, and then if you observe, then you begin to find then plants over there that shouldn't be there. So then, what can you expect of this year? We can expect then Mr. Xi from China, the kingdom of the east, making a deal with the kingdom of the south, Africa, regarding Congo. When they make a deal, and then they begin their industrial quest of then organizing then the mines of Congo, then the first chapter of Ezekiel then starts. The big machine, this big clock of synchronisms. Very important. But this is gradual. At the very moment, each layer they are then organized, then at the first time Mr. Xi and Mr. Kabila they make a deal, then the first section of the clock of Ezekiel then turns on. From then on is situation after situation, event after event, until we get closer and closer of the time of the end, and then more synchronisms then take place, and then the new Chinese system then becomes available via computer, and then the world is in a straight path then for the time of the end, known as autumn feast. Let's read these holy instructions with respect. Let's read it with confidence, because these are the true words of this Holy Creator, and He never made a mistake, and it won't be the first time. So then, let's enjoy it, and then the next time I'm going to verify more areas of revelation in Ezekiel and then Zechariah regarding then the bombs, where then Zechariah, the 5th chapter, explains the 10 cubits and 20 cubits bombs then later released. We're going to study those in depth and then wait for the autumn feast. As we do so, let's do respected, and then respect each other, and then teach each other, as then Shaliach Shaul has then give us then the example, and then the Messiah being the center point. So please stay tuned, much more is coming up.